Recording by Avai in March 2017. Secresy, or The Ruin on the Rock by Eliza Fenwick. Volume 2, Letter 11, from Caroline Ashburn to Sibella Valmont. I charge you, Sibella, by the value you affix to my friendship, that you remain at present passive. It is a term of probation for Clement on which the colouring of your future days depends. More of this hereafter. I write now with a kind of restless eagerness. Images, apprehensions, and even hopes, all finally resting on you, fill the place of soberer judgment. This wood-wanderer, this spirit, part mortal and part ethereal, fascinates my attention. I see him gliding through the paths you had trodden. The tree which screened him from your view cannot conceal him from mine. I see him listen almost breathless to your prayer. The newborn colour on his cheek hangs trembling, daring not then to depart, and the throbbings of his agonized bosom collect themselves while restrained, and give force to that sign whose utterance had echoed 1,000 times in my imagination. I see him dart the ball forward to meet your feet, and then he rushes into the thickest gloom to hide himself, if possible, even from himself. This is no spirit of your uncle's choosing, Sibella. No, it is one who has refined upon romance, who can give, I perceive, as much enthusiasm to the affections, and carve misery for himself as ingenuously, as though he had passed his days under the safeguard of Mr. Valmont's walls and drawbridges. He will protect, but cannot harm thee. In truth, I believe it. Go to the wood then, Sibella. See him, if possible, and tell me, did symmetry ever mould a statue in finer proportions than his form can boast? His eye in its passive state is a clear grey, its shape long, and the finest eyebrow and eyelash that ever adorned mortal face, not excepting even yours, Sibella, belong to his. Hold him in conversation, and you will see that eye almost emit fire. It will dazzle you with its rays. Or, if a softer subject engage him, it can speak so submissively to the heart that words become but the secondary medium of his theme. Observe how his hair, bursting from confinement into natural ringlets around his temples, contrasts itself with the fairness of his complexion, fair without effeminacy. His colour is of a doubtful kind, for it retires as you perceive it, or suffuses the whole of his fine countenance, just as you had begun to lament that he was too pale. His nose and mouth, though somewhat large and perhaps irregular, yet admirably correspond with the harmony of the whole face. You probably will think Clement's glowing face handsomer. I do not. Chase but by one smile and dissatisfaction of your spirit, and there will be a radiance, if I may so call it, beam upon you, that my best art fails to delineate. I shall not underwrite the name till you have judged of my painting. Cease your astonishment, my friend, for I am no sorceress, and the sprite is too ethereal, too imaginative, to hold counsel with a mere mortal like me. To the means of his being with you I confess I have no clue, but if you read my former letters you will perhaps find mention of some few of the reasons and circumstances which incline me to infer I have discovered him. You will find, though, what I am now about to tell you, for my heart only transmitted it to my understanding, where it remained to have its justice and propriety closely investigated. Yes, Sibella, wild, variable, and inconsistent as is this spirit of your woods, I could have loved him if he would have let me. But 'tis past, 'twas a trace on the sands. Love shall never write its lasting characters on my mind till my reason invites it, and where hopes rests not, reason cannot abide. Clement's eagerness to cultivate our acquaintance is by no means flattering. I have known him but a week. It was at the opera that I observed Laundy's eye stealing to the adjoining box with something more than mere inquisitiveness. Mine followed. A party of young men occupied the box, all known to me except one, and from the position in which the stranger sat, neither Laundy nor I could gain more than an oblique view of his face. Now I do acknowledge that even this oblique view gave promise of the whole being worthy of observation, yet my curiosity lulled itself to repose till the Duchess de N, constantly of our parties, arose at the end of another act to gaze around with that confidence which women of a certain rank deem infinitely becoming in themselves, though if perceived in a shopkeeper's wife or daughter, downright impudence alone would be called its proper description. "Ah!" screamed the Duchess, "le Chevalier Montgomery!" Clement, for it was your Clement, starting from his former posture, bowed hastily, and, having carelessly looked on the rest of the party, returned to his seat. Poor I, all flutter and palpitation, eager to know if this Montgomery was the identical Montgomery, was almost in despair that he should not avail himself of the Duchess's recognition, but she was not to be so baffled. With some trouble, on account of the nabob's gouty toe, she displaced Sir Thomas and Lady Barlow, and got close to the box. Already had she raised her fan to accost him with the tap of familiarity, when I heard Mr. Hanway, his companion, say, "Mrs. and Miss Ashburn." Clement's eye instantly met mine. A smile gathered round his mouth, and in 2 seconds he was in our box, regularly introduced by Mr. Hanway. For the first minute I was sure he resembled you. In the next the likeness became indistinct, and in 2 more I lost it entirely. His face, with all its advantages of complexion, colour, brilliant eyes, and exquisite teeth, has not the variety which yours possesses, though to say here that he is less handsome than any creature upon earth is almost a crime, and the ladies scruple as little to tell him he is a phoenix as to think him one. We had scarcely any conversation that evening, for my mother and the Duchess vied with each other in their attention to Montgomery. Lady Barlow could not claim a share of him, though Sir Thomas immediately recollected Clement and renewed their acquaintance with apparent pleasure. "Don't you remember, Mr. Montgomery," said the nabob, "the day you and Arthur set out for the Continent you dined with me? How much everybody was delighted with my nephew's vivacity. That very day a gentleman said to me, Sir Thomas, and a very great judge he was, I assure you, 'Sir Thomas,' said he, 'your nephew will make a figure in the world. If you bring him into Parliament, what with his abilities and his relationship to you, Sir Thomas, he may stand almost anywhere in this country.' Well, Mr. Montgomery, when I sent for him home so much sooner than I first intended, it was because this gentleman's advice appeared to me very good, and because he further told me no time was to be lost. Home Arthur came, and I could have bought him a borough the next day. No, indeed, he said, he would neither buy votes nor sell votes, nor did the conduct of Parliament please him, nor could he. In short, he had so many faults to find and objections to make that he out-talked me, and I couldn't tell what to say to him. But, thought I, he will think better of it, and I let the matter rest a while, and made another proposal in the meantime, and had he done as I wished, he would now have been one of the richest men perhaps in the kingdom. Yet, upon my soul, he point-blank refuses this too, and talked as much of principle and integrity and I know not what, as in t'other case. 'Twas damned insolent, and so I told him. No, nor had he ever the modesty to ask my pardon, but took it all as coolly as you can imagine. Well, and when I forgave him of my own accord, and behaved to him more kindly than ever, he has taken some new freak into his brain, and playing so many odd tricks of late that I am actually afraid of him. Oh, never was such an unaccountable, said Lady Barlow. The ball night at Bath, added my mother, laughing. His letters are algebra to me, said Clement, and I have been half tempted to forswear his correspondence. Last winter, said Mr. Hanway, he made conquests by dozens. Some cruel fair one is revenging, I suppose, her slighted sex. In love, no doubt. I believe not, replied Clement, and the conversation ended, for the Duchess now chose to talk, and never having seen this incomprehensible, irresistible Murden, she could not talk of him, you know. The party adjourned to sup at Sir Thomas Barlow's, we and the Duchess de N. by a previous engagement, Clement and Mr. Hanway in consequence of the baronet's pressing invitations. Mademoiselle Laundy complained of indisposition, and returned home immediately from the opera. She, as well as her friend the Duchess, had been acquainted with Clement in Paris, but after the first cold bow, Mademoiselle Laundy remained unnoticed by him. No man could be more gallant, more gay, or unrestrained than your chevalier, as the Duchess persists in calling him. At the nabob's table we met several persons of fashion, to whom he was already known, and by whom he was treated with attention. His person and manners are no trivial recommendation, and the belief, which everywhere prevails of his being heir to Mr. Valmont, supports his consequence with its due proportion of power. I debated with myself to determine whether or not this belief ought to pass without contradiction, and, foreseeing many injurious consequences that might arise to Clement from the expenses and dissipation which it encouraged, I resolved to seek an early opportunity of conversing with and encouraging him to disown the supposition. No opportunity occurred during that evening, but ere we separated, Clement was engaged to dine on the succeeding day in one of my mother's private parties. I very seldom breakfast with my mother, our hours of rising and morning avocations are so different. However, I went to her dressing-room that morning, purposely to talk of your Clement. I spoke much of your attachment to each other, and Mrs. Ashburn immediately declared she would take his constancy under her protection, as such elegance and accomplishments, she said, as those possessed by Mr. Montgomery, would be assailed with more temptation than such charming candour and simplicity might be able to withstand. To Miss Laundy my mother appealed for her confirmation of Clement's praise, and she either did, or I fancied she did, give her assent with a languor and inattention not usual to her. I had no reason, however, to accuse her of inattention when I hinted at the change in Clement's expectations, for, although my mother suffered it to pass unnoticed, Mademoiselle Laundy thought proper to press questions on me relative to this subject. I resented her inquisitive curiosity on a point which could not in any way concern her, and, declining to answer her questions, I quitted the room. To join a private party, my mother had invited Clement. That was 15 visitors, placed at a table covered with the most luxurious delicacies served in gilt plate, and surrounded with attendants as numerous as the company. Mrs. Ashburn, less splendid, but more tasty than usual in her dress and ornaments, was studiously attentive to Clement, declared herself his guardian, and spoke with rapturous admiration of you, Sibella, but without naming you. Clement blushed, bowed, returned compliment for compliment, and, graceful in all his changes, assumed an air and mien of exaltation. Sometimes he turned his eye toward Mademoiselle Laundy. The evening had far advanced before I could engage him in any conversation. He then showed me a letter from your uncle, wherein, to my very great surprise, Mr. Valmont desires Clement to be cautious in confiding his prospects or intentions to anyone, bids him study mankind and despise them, tells him he does not mean to limit him to the sum he has already in his possession, if more should be necessary, and advises him to be speedy in his choice of a profession, talks of the value of disappointment, the blessings of solitude, the duty of obedience, of his own wisdom, his own prudence and power, begins with the kind of appellation of "my dear adopted son," concludes with the stern Valmont-like phrase of "your friend as you conduct yourself." Here my interference ends. Henceforward Mr. Valmont plans, and Clement executes, each in his own way. Your uncle has quite an original genius, Sibella. Following no common track, he labours only to make a glare by strong opposition of colours, and to surprise by contrariety of images. To Clement's murmurs against Mr. Valmont succeeded a little species of delirium, for I named you, and no impassioned lover-like epithet was omitted in the recital of your charms. Whatever, Sibella, may be my own vanity and pretensions, I could hear praises of your beauty from 1,000 tongues without envy or weariness. Yet from Clement a slighter mention would have pleased me better. He is the chosen of your heart, and should prize the mind you possess equal to heaven. An angel's beauty might be forgotten, when the present and future contemplation of such a mind could be brought in view. Alas, your lover is no philosopher. He laments the energy which I idolize. Allow me to indulge the percipient quality I suppose myself to possess, and sketch Montgomery when my messenger presents him the letter you enclosed to me. No sooner does he behold that writing, than Sibella rises to his view in all her grace and loveliness. Could he give existence to the vision, that moment would be too rich in transport. He trembles with an exquisite unsatisfied delight, and, while the senseless paper receives his eager kisses, he could fight dragons, or rush through fire to obtain you. At length he reads. Well, the same Sibella is there, she whom he calls the most perfect and lovely of all God's creatures, the same Sibella whose enchantments cast a magic illusion around the horror-nodding woods of Valmont. The same Sibella, but poor and dependent, is now quitting those woods for ever and ever. She leaves behind her even the trace of wealth, and flies, an outcast, to Clement, who, involved in the same ruin, has neither fortune, fame, nor friend. Delightful expectations vanish, torture succeeds, and the agony of this prospect to Clement could in no one instance be equalled, except perchance by the knowledge of your being in the possession of a rival, and lost to him for ever. I suspect there are some latent shades in this picture which will displease you, but remember, my ever dear girl, that early, even at the commencement of our intimacy, we reciprocally laid it down as a solemn truth that without full and entire confidence friendship is of no value. I have said that Clement and you love from habit. Nor let it wound you that I say so still, for I am willing to seek conviction, and though I cannot be more candid than now, nor ever more worthy of your affection than while I am offending your heart to inform your judgment, yet if conviction meet me, I shall be more joyful by millions of degrees in owning I had mistaken. At all events, whether Clement approves or disapproves the intention, your leaving your uncle and his castle now would be decidedly wrong. Your education, constantly in opposition to that which a dependent should have had, unfits you for entering the world without protection. You have so much to learn of the manners of society that perhaps any plan you might form would turn out the very reverse of your expectations. Stay, patiently if you can, at any rate stay till Clement makes his final determination, and then I'll tell you more of my mind. Be happy, my sweet, my beloved friend. You have it largely in your power, and surely 'tis better to summon fortitude and walk boldly over a few thorns than creep through miserable paths to avoid them, or sit down idly to bemoan their situation. Caroline Ashburn. P.S. I have opened my letter in consequence of a visit from Clement Montgomery. He came to me, Sibella, agitated and trembling. Your letter had conjured up a horrible train of fears and suppositions, and he was scarcely assured the evil he most dreaded had not already arrived. "Rash, cruel Sibella!" he exclaimed. "Even now, perhaps, you have forever undone me with Mr. Valmont." I reminded him that you had said in the concluding lines of your letter to me that you waited, though unwillingly, for Clement's determination. "Oh, that is true," cried he, "and 'tis my salvation. Dear Miss Ashburn, conjure her by your love and my own to guard our secret faithfully from her uncle. Tell her she cannot judge of the destruction she would hurl upon my head if she were now to betray me. Tell her, I entreat, I insist, that she make not one attempt to quit the castle. Will you, dear Miss Ashburn, undertake this kind office? Will you turn the adorable romantic girl from her mad enterprise?" "Certainly, Mr. Montgomery," I replied. "I will deliver your own message exactly in your own words. As to my opinion, I have given it to Sibella already. It is against her quitting the castle." I should also have told Clement what were my motives for wishing you to remain with your uncle, had not my mother and Mademoiselle Laundy at that instant entered the room. Their presence, however, did not prevent Clement from thanking me with great warmth, and, the worst of his fears being now removed, his countenance again brightened into smiles, and he readily acquiesced in my mother's wish of his attending her to convey him to his lodgings to dress, and, as he quitted us, I bade him remember the purpose for which he came to London. Blushes covered his face, and he departed without speaking. Once more, adieu. Forget not the wood haunter. End of Section 28.